Hi guys, and welcome to this video on Act 4, Scene 3 from Macbeth. And I'm going to split this scene into two parts because it's quite a long scene. So in the first part we're going to see Macduff go to England and petition Malcolm to raise an army to go to Scotland and try and overthrow Macbeth. Now in this scene, Macduff is trying to persuade Malcolm to get the courage together to act in this way, but Malcolm is quite hesitant to assume the role of King of Scotland. He believes that he would be a king equally as bad as Macbeth. He outlines lusts and greeds and avarice that he feels would not make him a good king in the same way that his father Duncan was a good king. Eventually, Macduff manages to persuade Malcolm, and at the end of this part of the scene, we'll see them agree, and Malcolm promise that England is going to put an army together to go and overthrow Macbeth. But before we look at the annotation, let's have a listen to the scene.
Let us seek out some desolate shade, and there weep our sad bosoms empty.
Let us rather hold fast the mortal sword, and like good men bestride our downfall and birthdom. Each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry. New sorrows strike heaven on the face, that it resounds, as if it felt with Scotland and yelled out like syllable of dolour.
What I believe I'll wail, what no believe, and what I can redress as I shall find a time to friend I will. What you have spoke, it may be so perchance. This tyrant, whose sole name blisters our tongues, was once thought honest. You have loved him well. He hath not touched you yet. I am young, but something you may deserve of him through me, and wisdom to offer up a weak, poor, innocent lamb to appease an angry god.
I am not treacherous.
But Macbeth is. A good and virtuous nature may recoil in an imperial charge. But I shall crave your pardon, that which you are, my thoughts cannot transpose. Angels are bright still, though the brightest fell. Though all things foul would wear the brows of grace, yet grace must still look so.
I have lost my hopes.
Perchance even there where I did find my doubts. Why, in that rawness, left you, wife and child, without leave-taking?
Bleed. Bleed, poor country. The title is afeard. Fare thee well, Lord.
I would not be the villain that thou thinkst, for the whole space that's in the tyrant's grasp, and the rich east to boot.
Be not offended. I speak not as in absolute fear of you. I think our country sinks beneath a yoke, it weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds. I think withal there would be hands uplifted in my right, and here from gracious England have I offer of goodly thousands. Yet for all this, when I shall tread upon the tyrant's head, or wear it on my sword, yet my poor country shall have more vices than it had before through him that shall succeed.
What should he be?
It is myself, I mean, in whom I know all the particulars of vice, so grafted that when they shall be opened, black Macbeth will seem as pure as snow.
Not in the legions of horrid hell can come a devil more damned in evils to top Macbeth.
Oh, I grant him bloody, luxurious, avaricious, false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking of every sin that hath a name. But there's no bottom, none to my voluptuousness. Your wives, your daughters, your matrons and your maids could not fill up the cistern of my lust. Better Macbeth than such a one to reign.
Boundless intemperance in nature is a tyranny. It hath been the untimely emptying of the happy throne and fall of many kings. But fear not yet to take upon you what is yours. You may convey your pleasures in a spacious plenty, and yet seem cold. The time you may so hoodwink. We have willing dames enough. There cannot be that vulture in you to devour so many as will to greatness dedicate themselves, finding it so inclined.
With this there grows in my most ill-composed affection such a staunchless avarice, that were I king, then my more having would be as a source to make me hunger more, that I should forge quarrels unjust against the good and loyal, destroying them for wealth.
And this avarice sticks deeper, grows with more pernicious root than summer-seeming lust, yet do not fear. Scotland hath poisons to fill up your will of your mere own. All these are portable, with other graces weighed.
But I have none. The king becoming graces as justice, verity, temperance, stableness, bounty, perseverance, mercy, lowliness, devotion, courage, patience, fortitude. I have no relish of them, but abound in the division of each several crime, acting it many ways. Nay, had I power, I should pour the sweet milk of concord into hell, uproar the universal peace, confound all unity on earth.
Oh, Scotland. Scotland.
If such a one be fit to govern, speak. I am as I have spoken.
Fit to govern. No, not to live. Oh. Nation miserable. With an untitled tyrant, bloody sceptred. When shalt thou see thy wholesome days again? Since at the truest issue of thy throne, by his own interdiction stands accused, and does blaspheme his breed. Thy royal father was a most sainted king. The queen that bore thee, oftener upon her knees than on her feet, died every day she lived. Fare thee well. These evils thou repeat'st upon thyself hath banished me from Scotland. Oh, my breast. Thy hope ends here.
Macduff, this noble passion, child of integrity, hath from my soul wiped the black scruples, reconciled my thoughts to thy good truth and honor. Devilish Macbeth, by many of these trains, hath sought to win me into his power, and modest wisdom plucks me from over-credulous haste. But God above deal between thee and me, for even now I put myself to thy direction, and unspeak mine own detraction. Here, abjure the taints and blames I laid upon myself for strangers to my nature. I am yet unknown to woman. Never was forsworn. Scarcely have coveted what was mine own. At no time broke my faith. Would not betray the devil to his fellow. And delight no less in truth than life. My first false speaking was this against myself. What I am, truly, is thine, and my poor country is to command. Whither indeed, before thy here approach, 10,000 warlike men already at a point were setting forth. Now, wheel together. Why are you silent?
Such welcome and unwelcome things at once 'Tis hard to reconcile.
Well, more anon.
Okay, we'll stop there and have a look at some of this annotation. So, with this scene, I think it's really important to consider the main ideas behind it. The first being the idea of the punishment of traitors. We see this with the opinions and attitudes towards Macbeth and the ideas that they express around him being a tyrant and being a disease on the country of Scotland. But at the same time, within this idea of the punishment of traitors and treason itself is the idea of what makes someone a traitor, and in particular, what makes something an act of treason. This was something explored in the scene before, when Macduff's wife directly calls him a traitor. In this scene, he's very keen to prove that he is not a traitor. And I think that within the things that Malcolm says, we see that treason and loyalty, good and evil, right and wrong, are all a matter of perspective. And we'll touch on this across the scene as we investigate the things that he says. But certainly that fits in with the idea of fair is foul and foul is fair. If you remember right back to Act 1, Scene 1, when the witches are talking about the battle, a battle is a perfect encompassment for this kind of moral ambiguity. To the winners, the battle was fair. To the losers, the battle was foul. To somebody standing with Macbeth, his actions would be seen as fair, but to someone standing against Macbeth, his actions would be seen as foul. And I think that this is a lot of what Malcolm is trying to explore. And this all links in with the idea of the cycle of kings and the cycle of violence. This idea that with kings, whoever you are supporting, that is the rightful king. The other person, that is the illegitimate king. And with that always comes violence. And certainly within this scene, we're going to see the cycle of violence in this play progress back to the state of warfare that it was in at the beginning of the play. Okay? So let's look at the things that they say. So firstly, it's important to note that Malcolm talks in a dignified and stately manner. He echoes the language of Duncan. This is kind of high court speech. He also uses a great amount of equivocation and kind of tries to play his cards very close to his chest when dealing with Macduff. Also, we see quite a contrast between Malcolm and Macduff within the way that they speak. Malcolm uses a lot of cryptic language, whereas Macduff is very direct and kind of says exactly what he's thinking and exactly what he means. And we see some difference right here at the beginning. Malcolm says to Macduff, "Let us seek out some desolate shade, and there weep our sad bosoms empty." He wants to go to somewhere where there is an absence of light. Possibly because they're plotting and it's not very good for them to be seen, particularly if there are any spies from Macbeth. He then uses this non-masculine image, this idea of them weeping their sad bosoms empty. Now, this presents him as a weak character, quite a feminine character, and Macduff contrasts that directly through this violent, strong and masculine imagery of "let us rather hold fast the mortal sword, and like good men bestride our downfall and birthdom." This reference to mortal sword and them bestriding their downfall and birthdom talks about them acting, them going back to Scotland and taking by power the throne and reinstalling Malcolm. So you have Malcolm being weak and sad and Macduff being strong and confident. And these juxtaposing characteristics are going to follow them throughout this scene. We then see Macduff describing the situation in Scotland. He says, "Each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face." Now this obviously refers to Macbeth being a tyrant, but at the same time there is dramatic irony in the first thing he says, certainly, new widows howl. Right now, Macduff is a new widow. We as the audience know that his wife and children have been killed, but he doesn't know that. And I believe this dramatic irony helps to kind of emphasise the loss when Macduff finally finds out that his wife and children are dead. He talks about that these things strike heaven on the face. He is referring here to the unnatural deeds that people are witnessing within Scotland as a direct result of the breaking of the great chain of being. But also, these things are really powerfully negative. They're horrific things that are happening within Scotland. And could this be Macduff's Christianity coming out? You know, that God, seeing how the country is being treated, it's kind of a direct affront to him and his power. Malcolm is somewhat doubtful of what Macduff says, you know, and I think he's equivocating here to try and avoid looking at the realities of the situation. He says, "What I believe, I'll wail, and no believe." So, in not believing what Macduff is saying, there is doubt. There is doubt that Scotland really is that bad. You know, he isn't there. He's living in England. And he says that he wants to know the facts before he starts to believe that Scotland is really that bad. Because if he were to believe that Scotland was really that bad, he'd kind of be forced to take an army up there and try and get it off of Macbeth through war. He refers to Macbeth as a tyrant, showing his opinion of Macbeth, and he uses the verb blisters when describing the impact of Macbeth on their speech. You know, this blisters could indicate that it's painful to say his name, that it's painful for him to talk about him. But at the same time, you get a blister when you've overused something, you know, like on shoes that have rubbed too much. So potentially it is also that they're talking about Macbeth too much. You know, it blisters their tongues because they speak about him so often. Now, interestingly, Malcolm chooses to present the previous opinions of Macbeth to kind of juxtapose this image of him as a tyrant and establish this theme of what is good and what is evil. You know, he says to Macduff that he once thought Macbeth honest, that you have loved him well. You know, that in the past, Macduff was friends with Macbeth. It's only now that Macbeth has gone against the Great Chain and Duncan that Macduff has chosen to sort of abandon Macbeth and see him as this tyrant, whereas before, as I've said, you know, Macbeth was murdering and killing and all that stuff right back at the beginning of the play, but Macduff did not have a problem with that. You know, I think that kind of highlights some of the hypocrisy around loyalty, and in particular loyalty around struggles for kingdoms. Malcolm here uses some really strong dramatic irony, setting up the payoff for when Macduff finds out about his family being killed. He says, "He hath not touched you yet," you know, indicating that Macbeth hasn't had an impact on Macduff and his family yet. You know, we as an audience obviously know that he has. "I am young, but something you may discern of him through me." Malcolm feels that there is something within him that is like Macbeth. And I think this goes back to the role of kings. You know, remember, anyone in this situation that's given absolute power has the absolute power to do awful, awful things. And it's kind of within human nature to be greedy and to take things that you don't really need at the expense of others. And in this way, you know, he's asking Macduff, who can be good and who can be evil? Who can be considered loyal and who can be considered a traitor? And again, using his very direct language, Macduff replies to this, "I am not treacherous." Now, if you think back to the previous scene when Macduff's wife said to her son that his father was a traitor, think about what he's actually doing here. Macbeth technically is his king. Even though Macbeth's claim is illegitimate, he is still the king. But Macduff is here proposing treason against Macbeth. You know, and again, it's showing it's a matter of perspective. Malcolm recognises this and replies, "But Macbeth is, you know, literally, he's saying there that Macbeth did commit treason. He did murder Duncan. But at the same time, what Macduff is proposing is exactly what Macbeth did. So Macbeth is a traitor for murdering Duncan, the king, but Macduff is not a traitor for murdering Macbeth, the king. You know, it's this really interesting exploration of the grey area around right and wrong. Malcolm says there, "A good and virtuous nature may recoil in an imperial charge." And this is the idea that power corrupts. The idea that once you're given that supreme control over everybody, you're more likely to do horrible things than good things. And he uses biblical imagery to back this up. He says, "Angels are bright still, though the brightest fell." This is a reference to Satan and you know, the downfall of Satan from heaven into hell. He says, "Though all things foul would wear the brows of grace, yet grace must still look so." And this equivocation talks about how things that are bad can be presented as good, but the things that are good are also presented as good. So how do you tell which is right and which is wrong when they both look the same? This kind of cryptic talk, this use of equivocation, this kind of musing on what is right and what is wrong causes Macduff to just completely lose it. He says, "I've lost my hopes." And on this, Malcolm pounces and uses some juxtaposing wordplay by saying, "Perchance even there where I did find my doubts." So Macduff has lost hope in Malcolm because Malcolm is full of doubt and full of concern, whereas it's that doubt and concern that has led Malcolm to lose faith within himself. Macduff replies with "Bleed, bleed, poor country." He recognises that Macbeth's tyranny is destroying his land. But at the same time, bleed could be seen as a further reference to the motif of blood. Only at this point in the play, that blood is representative of pain of a nation. We've looked at how blood and its symbolism has changed across the play, even though it is a consistent motif, from things like power, guilt, vengeance, all of that kind of stuff. And here, it's used to represent all of the suffering within Scotland. Macduff then says, "Great tyranny, lay thou thy bases sure, for goodness dare not check thee." This is the idea that evil will win because good wouldn't fight. And it kind of links, I know it was said after this play was written, but the idea that all it takes for evil to flourish is for a few good men to do nothing. However, I think that the irony within this is that what Malcolm then reveals to Macduff shows that he is far from a good man. However, Macduff, thinking very plainly and very straightforwardly, says, "I would not be the villain that thou thinkst." This shows that he believes he wouldn't be corrupted, that if Macduff was put in the situation of Macbeth and had all of that power, he would act in a just and honourable way. Now, I think this betrays a certain amount of simplicity around Macduff, that he is so unwilling to accept that there could be anything other than black and white, good and evil. And I think that that lays him apart from Malcolm, and maybe sets Macduff up as a catalyst for further treason, after the events of the play. But we'll talk about that when we get to the end of the play. Malcolm replies, "Be not offended. I speak not as in absolute fear of you." So he doesn't have absolute fear of Macduff, or what Macduff will do if he fails. He has fear for himself. He fears what is inside him, the darkness within. He says, "I think our country sinks beneath the yoke." He recognises decline within Scotland, and that idea of the yoke, that's a symbol linked with servitude and slavery. This idea that Scotland is currently enslaved to Macbeth's every whim and desire. Malcolm says, "It weeps, it bleeds, and each new day a gash is added to her wounds." So Malcolm recognises that Scotland is in ruin, and he recognises that ruin is connected with violence, particularly the violence that Macbeth is perpetrating on its people. Malcolm then indicates that he has thousands of soldiers pledged from England to march on Scotland and help him take back his throne. "But for all this, when I shall tread upon the tyrant's head," this foreshadowing Macbeth's ultimate fate, "or wear it on my sword, or the consequences of my violence will be enacted, yet my poor country shall have more vices than it had before." So this is Malcolm showing that he believes he would be a worse king than Macbeth, that he would result in more terror and bloodshed and loss of Scottish people than even Macbeth has been able to perpetuate. Now, I think this, in some way, is Shakespeare exploring the cycle of monarchies. This idea that kings have power, other kings take that power through violence, and then more violence and more violence. And it's this idea that the monarchy is entrenched within that cycle of violence that we've talked about so much, because who are the people that start wars in this time? Kings, queens, lords, dukes. People of power constantly using poor people to get what they want. And I think through this conversation, Shakespeare is kind of exploring the morality of that, whether it is okay for a country to sacrifice its people for the whims of one person with power, or whether, they should have someone that cares and doesn't want to sacrifice those people. I'm not sure that Malcolm is the latter. I think that Malcolm is somewhat the first. And I'll explain my theory once more when we get to the end of the play. But this talks about how the cycle of monarchy, like I say, is linked with violence, but also vice, sin. The idea that the monarchy is linked with exploitation. We're going to see that with what Malcolm says in a minute. And ultimately, how the monarchy is a symbol of fear for the ordinary people within the countries that they rule. Malcolm says, "It is myself, I mean, in whom I know all the particulars of vice so grafted." So he feels that within him there is sin. "Then when they shall be opened, black Macbeth will seem as pure as snow," further emphasising the fact that he feels he would be a worse king than Macbeth. And interesting, look at the imagery he uses to describe Macbeth here. Black Macbeth, to link with evil and death. Now this is a good quotation to compare with, from the very beginning, what is said about brave Macbeth. This shows you how much Macbeth has fallen in the opinions of people around Scotland. He talks about his confineless harms, showing how bad he will be. Macduff then replies, "Not in the legions of horrid hell can come a devil more damned in evils to top Macbeth." Again, showing the opinion of Macbeth, linking with that religious allusion that Malcolm had earlier on when he talked about the devil falling from heaven. Macbeth very much representing Satan falling from the graces of God, where he was loyal to Duncan, into this depths of hell, where he is just perpetrating all of these violent crimes. Malcolm then says, "I grant him bloody, luxurious, avaricious, false, deceitful, sudden, malicious, smacking of every sin that has a name," showing how violent and guilty Macbeth really is of all of these terrible things. But he says, "But there's no bottom, none in my voluptuousness." And he goes on to worry about his sexual appetite and how that will cause him to be an even worse king than Macbeth. However, it is worth noting that he is voicing his worry. And this is very much unlike Macbeth. Macbeth kind of lives a little bit in denial that what he's doing is in some way justified. He's been prophesied that this is going to happen, and so he kind of deserves it. Whereas Malcolm is quite openly telling Macduff all the things that he is going to do that are wrong. Now Macduff's responses to these issues is very interesting, and I think goes back to the idea of good and evil is a matter of perspective. Macduff says, "Boundless intemperance in nature is a tyranny. It hath been the untimely emptying of the happy throne and the fall of many kings." This idea that greed has led to the downfall of many kings before Macbeth and before Malcolm, and it certainly will be the downfall for Macbeth within this play. But then Macduff says, "But fear not, yet to take upon you what is yours." He says, "Fear not to sit on the throne, because the great chain of being says that that throne belongs to you." He then shows that he can't really believe that Malcolm has these deep and endless appetites. He says, "There cannot be that vulture," a bird that is the epitome of greediness, "there cannot be that vulture in you to devour so many as will to greatness dedicate themselves, finding it so inclined." Saying there that there's going to be lots of women that want to sleep with him. Once he's King of Scotland, he's going to have his pick from hundreds and hundreds of women, so he can satisfy that need. Now, is that right? Is that fair that Macduff is saying to a man who said, "I have an insatiable appetite for women"? Macduff says, "That's fine. That's fine. There's loads of women. You'll be okay." Is that right? Now, Malcolm replies to this with this: "There grows in my most ill-composed affection such a staunchless avarice, that were I king, I should cut off the nobles for their lands, desire his jewels, and this other's house." He worries about his greed here. It's not just women. It's greed for lands, jewels, titles, houses. He would just take everything that he could. He says, "I should forge quarrels unjust against the good and the loyal." That he would try and start wars within his own people, that he would betray those people. And I want you to think about this. Does Malcolm here represent a new kind of king? I don't think he does. I think he represents everything that Macbeth is. We don't really know about Duncan and his appetites. Does he represent Duncan, really? All we see is that the lords love Duncan, that the royalty love Duncan. And again, Macduff replies, this avarice sticks deeper, grows with more pernicious root. This idea that greed is at the heart of the monarchies, that anyone that is going to be king will have a certain level of greed. However, he says, Scotland hath foisons to fill up your will. This is the idea that the land and the people will help to satisfy Malcolm's greed. Now, I ask you this, is it fair that a people and a country should make sacrifices to please a king? That people should be willing to give up the things that they own, the things that they hold dear, to satisfy the whims of one person that is in charge? Well, according to the Great Chain of Being, that is all fine, because once Malcolm is king, he can demand anything that he wants. But I wonder if Shakespeare is asking the audience whether they think that is fair. And obviously, again, this comes down to a matter of perspective. Here, Macduff is condoning Malcolm's greed, but at the same time condemning Macbeth's greed. Malcolm then says that he has none of the king becoming graces, and he outlines what he believes are the qualities of a good king. And many of these qualities link with King Duncan, showing that in Malcolm's eyes, King Duncan was a good king. However, he says, I have no relish of them, but abound in the division of each several crime, acting it many ways. He has no time for the good qualities of a king. He would just want to do bad things. And he goes on to use imagery from Macbeth and Lady Macbeth here. He says that he would pour the sweet milk of concord into hell, mirroring Lady Macbeth's words around giving up her milk for gall. The idea that he would sacrifice nourishment of his people, providing a peaceful and stable time for them to live in, that he would throw that all to hell, that he would uproar the universal peace, just like Macbeth did in murdering King Duncan, causing nature to revolt, causing more of these unnatural things to be happening around the country in response to him as a king. In short, Malcolm presents himself as a terrible king. He knows that he wouldn't be good. And again, I ask, is this Shakespeare presenting the idea that no one would be a good king? That there is no such thing as a good king? Because once you give someone ultimate power, then they can do whatever they want, and they will serve their own interests above the interests of the people of the country they rule. Macduff then rejects Malcolm. Malcolm asks, if such a one be fit to govern, speak, I am as I have spoken. And Macduff says, fit to govern, no, not to live. Now, I don't believe that Macduff rejects Malcolm because he said that he's going to be a bad king. I believe that he rejects Malcolm because he refuses to fight. And because then he says, O nation miserable, with an untitled tyrant, bloody sceptred. So Macbeth doesn't have an official claim on the throne, and he is violent, and has become king through violence. When shalt thou see thy wholesome days again? Personifying the country and asking when the country will return to peaceful times and happy times. And he describes Duncan as the most sainted king, showing his opinion of him as a good king and his opinion of Macbeth as a terrible king. He ends with, fare thee well, these evils thou repeatest upon myself hath banished me from Scotland, showing that he has lost all hope in returning to Scotland or returning to a Scotland of peace. Coupled with that, if he returns to Scotland without Malcolm and an army, Macbeth will surely have him killed. So he knows that because Malcolm won't support him, that's it. He can no longer return. Now something really interesting happens here. And Malcolm completely changes his mind. We need to think a little bit about why Malcolm changes his mind here. He's just presented himself as this truly horrific king that's going to commit all of these sins and going to be really terrible for the people of Scotland. But pretty much straight away, he says that Macduff's childlike integrity hath wiped the black scruples, reconciled my thoughts to thy good truth and honour. So the black scruples, the black morality that he was talking about before is gone. Reconciled my thoughts. Any doubt is gone. Just on that little speech from Macduff. To start with, this shows that he trusts Macduff a lot, in the same way that Macduff trusted Macbeth. Now, is that a good look? To put all of your trust in one person? It hasn't been a good look for Duncan. He then says, I put myself to thy direction. He gives himself to Macduff, furthering that trust. He then reveals kind of the shocker for him. He says, I am yet unknown to woman, presenting himself as a virgin, that he's a pure and innocent character, really, after all of those things that he's just said. And yeah, this leads to, like I say, why has Malcolm changed so quickly? It could be a couple of things. Malcolm could be a malleable, weak character, bending to the whims of strong people around him, moving with their direction. Now I ask, is that a good quality for a king? Indecisiveness, able to be manipulated by people around you. Furthermore, it could be that Malcolm is being dishonest, and that subconsciously he sees supporting Macduff as a way to gain all of those things that he wants. I mean, he's just said, I want to sleep with lots of women. And Macduff replies with, great, there's lots of women you can sleep with. He says, I want to have all of the things within the land. And Macduff says, we can give you it all. It's fine. So maybe this is Malcolm thinking, if I pretend to be a good and virtuous king, then Macduff will support me and I can go back to Scotland and I can behave in whichever way I want. Now I will include this here. At the end of the play, we see Malcolm and Macduff defeat Macbeth. However, we don't have a resolution to Fleance's story. Fleance will become king and have a long line of kings. Now, does that mean at some point Fleance is going to raise an army and take Scotland off of whoever is the king then, be it Malcolm or somebody else? But certainly, leaving the story of Fleance overhanging with this plot opens up this play to the idea that there's going to be further revolution and further fighting against whoever is king, which, at the end of the play, is Malcolm. So could we assume from that Malcolm goes on to be a terrible king and do all of the things that he does, and that Fleance arrives in Scotland at some point in his future and kills Macduff and Malcolm and takes that throne and establishes a new kind of kingship in the country? We don't know, and we never will. But certainly it's worth bearing in mind, and particularly worth bearing in mind why Shakespeare left that Fleance storyline kind of unresolved. Malcolm then says, Old Seward, with 10,000 warlike men already at a point, was setting forth, showing Macduff that there is already an army approaching Scotland. This is the start of the war part of the cycle of violence. It's the beginning of the battle that the play begins with. The play starts with a king fighting someone who has committed treason, a traitor. The play ends with a king fighting people that are, committing treason, or from the perspective of Malcolm, a king who should be king fighting someone who committed treason. The play ends and begins with the same kind of image. Now, to this sudden change of mind, Macduff says such welcome and unwelcome things at once. Now, this is a piece of equivocation, and we don't really see Macduff equivocate very often. I think that this indicates that there is some kind of unsettling thought within him, to wonder why this sudden change. And I believe that those welcome and unwelcome things could be Malcolm. That it's unwelcome that Malcolm will be a bad king. It's unwelcome the things that Malcolm has said, but welcome that Malcolm will go with Macduff and fight in Scotland and will take back the throne. Similarly, it could be around the start of the actual war, the idea that it is good that they're going to go have a war in Scotland, but that ultimately any kind of war is bad because, it involves people dying. Okay, so that's the first half of Act 4, Scene 3. I hope you found it useful, and I'll speak to you all again soon. Bye-bye.